If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and impending rain across the Colorado Territory as the stagecoach lurched through another pothole on the mountain trail. Inside, Margaret Sullivan gripped her leather satchel tighter, her knuckles white against the worn brown leather. The 24-year-old schoolteacher had traveled from Boston to the remote mining town of Silver Creek, answering an advertisement for an educated woman to teach the children of prospectors and settlers. The coach driver, a grizzled man named Pete, spat tobacco juice over the side and called back to his passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be stopping at Deadman's Pass for water and rest. Stretch your legs but don't wander far. These mountains got more secrets than a preacher's got sins." His weathered face creased with concern as he scanned the towering pine trees that flanked the narrow road. Margaret peered out the small window at the imposing landscape. Massive granite cliffs rose on both sides of the trail, their faces scarred by centuries of wind and weather. Ancient pines clung to impossible angles, their gnarled roots finding purchase in the smallest cracks. The sky above had turned an ominous shade of grey, heavy with storm clouds that promised to unleash their fury before nightfall. As the stagecoach rounded a bend, Pete suddenly yanked hard on the reins, bringing the horses to a snorting, nervous halt. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle beside his seat. Ahead, blocking the narrow trail, lay a massive fallen pine tree, its trunk easily 4 feet thick. Fresh wood chips scattered the ground around it, and the clean cut marks were clearly visible even from a distance. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation," Pete announced to his passengers, his voice carrying a warning tone that made Margaret's stomach clench with sudden fear. "This tree didn't fall natural-like. Someone's been mighty busy with an axe." He stood up in his seat, scanning the surrounding forest with the practiced eye of a man who'd survived too many years in hostile territory to ignore his instincts. From the dense shadows of the pine forest came the sound of horses approaching at a steady trot. Margaret counted at least 4 riders, their silhouettes dark against the green backdrop of the trees. The men wore long dusters and wide-brimmed hats pulled low over their faces, and each carried a rifle across his saddle horn. Their leader, a tall man with a black beard streaked with silver, raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a command. "Afternoon, folks," the bearded man called out, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Appears you got yourselves a bit of a problem with that tree there." He nudged his horse closer to the stagecoach, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the situation. "Name's Calhoun, and these here are my associates. We'd be mighty happy to help you folks out of this predicament." Pete's grip tightened on his rifle, though he kept it pointed away from the strangers. "That's mighty neighborly of you, mister, but we can manage just fine. Got ropes and pulleys in the boot, and strong backs among the passengers." His tone was polite but firm, the kind of careful diplomacy that frontier men used when they sensed danger but weren't quite ready to start shooting. Calhoun's smile didn't reach his eyes as he gestured to his men, who began to spread out in a semicircle around the stagecoach. "I'm afraid I must insist on lending a hand. You see, this here's a toll road now, and we're the official collectors. Standard rate is everything you got, including that pretty little schoolmarm in the fancy dress." His gaze fixed on Margaret through the window, making her skin crawl with revulsion. The interior of the stagecoach suddenly felt suffocating as Margaret realized the true nature of their situation. The other passengers, an elderly merchant and his wife, huddled together in terrified silence. The merchant's trembling hands fumbled with the clasp of his money pouch, but his wife grabbed his wrist and shook her head frantically. Outside, she could hear Pete's voice rising in anger and defiance. "You boys picked the wrong coach to rob," Pete declared, bringing his rifle to bear on Calhoun. I've been riding these trails for nigh on 20 years, and I ain't about to let some two-bit bandits take what ain't theirs." The click of his rifle's hammer being cocked echoed through the mountain air like a death knell, and Margaret found herself holding her breath as the tension reached a breaking point. The forest erupted in violence as Calhoun's men opened fire simultaneously. Pete got off one shot before 3 bullets found their mark, sending him tumbling from the driver's seat to land in a crumpled heap beside the front wheel. The elderly merchant tried to shield his wife as one of the bandits yanked open the stagecoach door, his leering face framed by greasy black hair and several days' worth of stubble. "Well, well, what have we here?" the bandit drawled, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco as he leaned into the coach. "A real lady, all dressed up for church." He grabbed Margaret's arm with fingers that felt like iron bands, hauling her from the relative safety of the coach into the harsh mountain air. The wind whipped her brown hair around her face as she struggled against his grip, her feet barely touching the ground. Calhoun dismounted and approached with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this many times before. "Miss Sullivan, I presume?" "Yes, we know all about you, schoolteacher. Word travels fast in these parts, especially when someone as pretty as you comes through. You're going to be our guest for a while, at least until someone comes up with enough gold to buy you back." His smile was cold and calculating, like a snake sizing up its prey. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. How did they know her name? Who had told them about her journey? The questions swirled in her head as rough hands bound her wrists with coarse rope that bit into her skin. The elderly couple was allowed to flee on foot toward the nearest town, their terrified sobs echoing off the canyon walls as they stumbled away through the underbrush. As the bandits prepared to leave, Margaret caught a glimpse of movement in the trees high above the trail. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure watching from a rocky outcrop, but when she looked again, there was nothing but wind-bent pines and gathering storm clouds. The bandits hoisted her onto the back of a spare horse, and within minutes, they were riding deep into the wilderness, leaving behind only Pete's lifeless body and the overturned stagecoach. The bandit camp was hidden in a narrow canyon, about 2 hours' ride from the ambush site. Steep walls of red sandstone rose on 3 sides, providing natural fortification against pursuit. A small stream meandered through the canyon floor, its banks lined with cottonwoods that had turned brilliant gold in the autumn air. The outlaws had constructed rough shelters from fallen logs and canvas tarps, creating a temporary base that could be abandoned quickly if necessary. Margaret was shoved into a crude lean-to built against the canyon wall, its interior dim and musty, with the smell of old blankets and unwashed bodies. Her hands were tied to a thick wooden post, driven deep into the ground, and her ankles were bound with more rope. Through the gaps in the canvas walls, she could see the bandits going about their daily routines, cleaning weapons, tending horses, and drinking from bottles of stolen liquor. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the canyon, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that made Margaret's teeth chatter uncontrollably. The thin dress she'd worn for travel provided little protection against the mountain air, and the rough wool blanket one of the bandits had tossed her was crawling with fleas and reeked of horse sweat. She huddled in the corner of her prison, fighting back tears and trying to stay warm. Meanwhile, 30 miles away in the town of Redemption, a man sat alone at a corner table in the Broken Wheel Saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the other patrons with eyes that missed nothing. Ezra Blackwood had been many things in his 43 years. Soldier, lawman, husband, father, and finally, bounty hunter. Now he was simply a man trying to drink away memories that refused to stay buried. The saloon's batwing doors swung open with a crash, and the elderly merchant from the stagecoach stumbled in, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt and tears. "Help us," he gasped, collapsing against the nearest table. "They killed Pete. They took the schoolteacher. Someone's got to do something." His wife appeared behind him, her grey hair disheveled and her eyes wide with shock and exhaustion. Ezra's hand paused halfway to his glass as he absorbed the man's words. Around the saloon, conversations died as patrons turned to listen to the merchant's frantic tale. The bartender, a portly man named Jake, came around the bar with a bottle of medicinal whiskey and a clean cloth. "Easy there, partner," he said gently. "Take your time and tell us what happened." Between gasps and sobs, the merchant recounted the ambush at Dead Man's Pass. He described Calhoun and his men in detail, their method of operation, and the cold-blooded murder of the stagecoach driver. When he mentioned that the bandits had specifically asked for the schoolteacher by name, Ezra's jaw tightened with professional interest. This wasn't a random robbery, it was a carefully planned kidnapping. "The sheriff's out of town chasing cattle rustlers," Jake announced to the room. "Won't be back for at least a week. Anyone know where we can find help?" His question was met with uncomfortable silence as the patrons avoided eye contact. Everyone knew the reputation of Calhoun's gang, and none were eager to face their guns for the sake of a stranger, even an innocent schoolteacher. Ezra stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor in the sudden quiet. He was a tall man, lean and weathered like old leather, with prematurely grey hair and eyes the colour of winter storms. A navy Colt rode low on his right hip, its grip worn smooth by years of use. "I'll find her," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to violence and its consequences. The merchant looked up with desperate hope flooding his tear-stained face. "You're a lawman? A sheriff?" Ezra shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "No, I'm not a lawman anymore. I'm just a man who owes the world a debt, and maybe this is how I start paying it back." He tossed a silver dollar on the table to cover his drink and headed for the door, his spurs chiming softly against the floorboards. Outside, the night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and horses from the town's modest collection of buildings. Ezra's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, stood patiently at the hitching post, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The animal nickered softly as Ezra approached, recognizing the familiar scent and sound of his master. Ezra checked his gear methodically, the way he'd learned during his years as a cavalry officer. His Winchester rifle was secure in its scabbard, and his saddlebags contained enough supplies for a week in the wilderness. Extra ammunition, dried beef, hardtack, and a small pot for brewing coffee were packed with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to travel light and live off the land. As he prepared to mount up, the merchant appeared at his elbow, pressing a small leather pouch into his hands. "It's all we have left," the old man said quietly. "Please. She's just a young woman trying to make her way in the world. She doesn't deserve this." Ezra felt the weight of the coins through the leather and nodded grimly. "I'll bring her back," he promised, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. The ride to Deadman's Pass took him through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the Colorado Territory. Towering peaks rose on all sides, their snow-capped summits gleaming silver in the moonlight. The trail wound through dense forests of pine and aspen, across rushing streams, and along narrow ledges where a single misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into the abyss below. Ezra reached the ambush site just as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The overturned stagecoach sat like a wounded animal beside the trail, its broken wheel and scattered luggage telling the story of the violence that had occurred here. Pete's body lay where it had fallen, already attracting the attention of carrion birds that scattered reluctantly at Ezra's approach. The bounty hunter dismounted and began his examination of the scene with the methodical patience of a man who'd tracked killers across half the frontier. The bandits had left plenty of sign. Hoofprints in the soft earth, broken branches where they'd forced their way through the underbrush, and most importantly, the direction they'd taken when they departed with their captive. Ezra knelt beside one particularly clear hoofprint, studying its size and shape. The horse that had made it was unshod, a detail that would help him distinguish it from the others when the trail became confused. He made note of a distinctive chip in the animal's left front hoof, a mark that would be as unique as a fingerprint if he could keep following it. The trail led northwest, deeper into the mountains and away from the main roads where help might be found. Ezra followed it patiently, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. Here, the bandits had stopped to rest their horses. There, they'd watered the animals at a mountain stream. The sign was hours old, but it was clear enough for a man with his experience to follow. As the sun climbed higher, Ezra began to close the gap between himself and his quarry. The bandits were traveling at a leisurely pace, confident in their ability to avoid pursuit. They'd made no effort to conceal their trail, apparently believing that no one would be foolish enough to follow 4 armed men into the wilderness. It was a mistake that would cost them dearly. The trail wound through a series of narrow canyons and hidden valleys, each more remote than the last. Ezra pushed Thunder hard, but not recklessly, knowing that a lame horse would mean failure and probably death for both himself and the woman he was tracking. The animal responded with the steady endurance of a creature that had carried its rider through countless dangerous situations. By mid-afternoon, Ezra could smell wood smoke on the wind, carried by the shifting mountain breezes. He was close now, perhaps within a mile of the bandit camp. He found a secluded spot to leave Thunder, securing the horse with enough rope to reach both water and grass, but keeping him ready for a quick departure. The final approach would have to be made on foot, using every skill he'd learned in 20 years of hunting dangerous men. The canyon where the bandits had made their camp was a natural fortress, but it was also a trap. Ezra spent an hour working his way around the rim, studying the layout below and counting the number of men he could see. 4 bandits, just as the merchant had described, plus their horses and the woman he'd come to rescue. The camp was well positioned but poorly guarded, another sign of the outlaws' overconfidence. From his vantage point high above, Ezra could see Margaret huddled in her makeshift prison, her slight form barely visible in the shadows of the lean-to. She appeared to be unharmed but obviously terrified, her head turning at every sound from the camp. The bandits were relaxed, confident in their isolation and the natural barriers that protected their hideout. Ezra waited until the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the bandits gathered around their campfire, passing bottles of whiskey and laughing at crude jokes. Their voices echoed off the canyon walls, making them sound like a much larger group than they actually were. The sound would also mask any noise he might make during his approach. The bounty hunter began his descent down the canyon wall, moving with the careful precision of a man whose life depended on absolute silence. Every footstep was placed with deliberate care, every handhold tested before he committed his weight to it. The rock face was treacherous in the darkness, but Ezra had learned long ago to trust his instincts and his experience over his eyes. Halfway down the canyon wall, a loose stone shifted under his boot and went clattering into the darkness below. Ezra froze, pressing himself against the rock and listening for any change in the sounds from the camp. For a moment, the bandits' conversation paused, but then resumed with no indication that they'd heard anything suspicious. He waited a full minute before continuing his descent, even more cautious than before. The final 50 feet of the descent brought him to the canyon floor, hidden in the deep shadows cast by the overhanging rock walls. From here, he could see the camp clearly, 4 men around a fire, their weapons within easy reach but not immediately in hand. The woman was perhaps 30 yards away, still tied to the post in her crude shelter. Between Ezra and his objective lay open ground that would have to be crossed without detection. Ezra checked his weapons one final time, ensuring that his Colt was loose in its holster and his knife was easily accessible. The Winchester would be useless in the close quarters fighting that was about to begin, so he left it propped against the canyon wall, where he could retrieve it later if necessary. This would be settled with handgun and blade, the way most fights in the frontier were won or lost. The first bandit died without a sound, Ezra's knife sliding between his ribs as he stepped away from the fire to relieve himself. The man's body was hidden in the shadows beyond the camp, and his absence went unnoticed by his companions for several precious minutes. When they finally began to call his name, Ezra was already in position for the next phase of his attack. "Charlie? Where'd you get to?" Calhoun stood up from the fire, his hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. "Charlie, answer me." The concern in his voice was evident as he scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. The other two bandits rose as well, their relaxed postures suddenly tense with suspicion and fear. Years of life on the wrong side of the law had taught them to trust their instincts, and those instincts were screaming warnings now. Ezra stepped into the firelight with his Colt already in his hand, the weapon steady and unwavering as it covered the three remaining outlaws. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd faced death many times and lived to tell about it. "I'm here for the woman. You can surrender now and face a judge, or you can die here in this canyon. Your choice." Calhoun's face twisted with rage as he recognized the threat to his carefully laid plans. "You're outnumbered, bounty hunter. 3-1 ain't good odds, even for a man with your reputation." His pale eyes flicked to his companions, gauging their readiness for the fight that was about to begin. "Boys, kill him, and we'll split the reward for his head 3 ways instead of 4. The gunfight that followed was brief but savage, the confined space of the canyon amplifying every shot until it sounded like a small war. Ezra's first bullet took the bandit to Calhoun's left in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the campfire in a shower of sparks. The second shot dropped the other subordinate as he tried to bring his rifle to bear, the heavy .44 slug punching through his heart and ending his threat permanently. Calhoun was faster than his men, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced speed. But Ezra had been fighting for his life when Calhoun was still robbing stagecoaches for pocket change, and his third shot caught the bandit leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the darkness. The outlaw chief fell to his knees, clutching the wound and cursing with a creativity that would have impressed a cavalry sergeant. "You're under arrest," Ezra announced, though his gun remained trained on the wounded man, "for robbery, kidnapping, and murder. You'll get a fair trial, which is more than you gave that stagecoach driver." He moved carefully toward Margaret's prison, keeping one eye on Calhoun as he cut the ropes that bound her to the post. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "Are you hurt?" Ezra asked gently, his rough hands surprisingly tender as he examined her for injuries. Margaret shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. "I'm going to get you out of here," he promised, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "But first, we need to secure our prisoner and collect the evidence. Can you stand?" She nodded weakly, drawing strength from his calm presence. The journey back to Redemption took 2 days, with Calhoun tied to his saddle and Margaret riding double behind Ezra on Thunder. The wounded bandit leader alternated between sullen silence and bitter complaints about his treatment, but Ezra ignored him completely. His attention was focused on the woman behind him, whose occasional shivers reminded him of the trauma she'd endured. They stopped frequently to rest, and Ezra proved to be surprisingly gentle in his care for Margaret. He brewed coffee over small fires, shared his rations without complaint, and never once made her feel like a burden. When she finally found the courage to ask about his past, he told her quietly about the family he'd lost to cholera and the badge he'd thrown away when justice had failed him. "I was a marshal once," he said, staring into the flames of their small campfire. "Had a wife and 2 children in Kansas. When the sickness came, I couldn't protect them. All my guns and all my experience, and I couldn't save the people who mattered most." His voice carried the weight of old grief, and Margaret felt her heart go out to this hard man who'd risked everything to save a stranger. The trial of Jeremiah Calhoun was the biggest event in redemption's short history. The outlaw was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to hang, though he escaped that fate by accepting a 20-year prison term in exchange for information about his gang's other crimes. Margaret testified with quiet courage, her dignified bearing impressing everyone in the packed courtroom. As the seasons turned and Margaret settled into her new life as Silver Creek's schoolteacher, she often thought about the man who'd saved her. Ezra had refused any reward, simply tipping his hat and riding away as quietly as he'd arrived. But sometimes, on clear mountain mornings, she thought she caught a glimpse of a lone rider on the distant trails, and she wondered if he was still out there, still fighting his own battles with the past. The legend of Ezra Blackwood continued to grow throughout the territory, though the man himself remained as elusive as mountain mist. Some said he'd gone to California, others claimed he'd headed north to Montana, but the children in Margaret's classroom loved to hear the story of the lonely bounty hunter who'd risked everything to save their teacher, and they always asked the same question at the end: would he ever come back? Years later, when Margaret had become one of the most respected educators in the territory, she would tell new students that heroes come in many forms. Sometimes they wear badges, sometimes they carry Bibles, and sometimes they're just broken men trying to find their way back to the light. But they all share one thing in common. When someone needs help, they answer the call, regardless of the cost to themselves. The mountains of Colorado still echo with tales of the Old West, stories of courage and redemption that remind us of a time when a man's word was his bond and justice was something you carried in your holster. These were the days when the frontier was still wild and untamed, when civilization was just a thin veneer over the harsh realities of survival, and when sometimes the only law was the law of the gun. What do you think drove Ezra to risk his life for a complete stranger? Was it guilt over his past failures, a desire for redemption, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what motivates a man to become a hero when the world has taken everything he loves.